was addressed at the RIOC meeting. We do have representatives actually from both the buyer and seller here tonight. Just some brief comments, and then any questions I'll try to answer, or perhaps Gretchen, or perhaps the actual parties can. Our ground lease with the tenant requires our consent, which is why we're here tonight, and which consent should not be unreasonably withheld. I think that we're still working out a lot of the details, so we're seeking authorization from you to move forward with this transaction and to negotiate that which needs to be negotiated. Very little needs to be negotiated on our behalf. There are certain requirements under the ground lease that we're going to adhere to, but the issues regarding affordability are subject to a regulatory agreement that HCR has been a party to negotiating. And the agreement regarding the freezing of TAP has been negotiated with Empire State Development, and I was informed today that the board of directors of Empire State Development passed and approved the freezing of the TAP. So that will mean that Roosevelt Islands Operating Corporation's portion of that TAP will also be frozen, and we will be required to pay 4.8% of that amount, which has been frozen until the end of the leasehold. Our CFO has completed the negotiation of the transaction payment that the seller has to pay, and we're comfortable that that is accurate. The final point that I think is relevant for Roosevelt Island Operating Corporation is set forth in the, I'll call it a term sheet, which is the letter that was forwarded by the assignee, which is that there's a commitment to put $20 to $25 million into the building, which is surely welcomed by our corporation, not only as the holder of the ground lease, but also as a tenant in some of the public spaces and retail spaces. With that said,
and before, in case anybody, in terms of the resolution, what the board is being asked to approve is in section 1, the consent to the assignment, right?
Mm-hmm.
In section 2, to agree to the preservation plan between UDC and the assignee, and the amendment to the TAP payments.
Correct.
Right? And 3, to authorize to the use of the property manager.
Correct.
Right? Those are the 3 main sort of big picture items.
Correct.
Okay. All right.
I'd like to introduce some small picture items.
Yes, yeah.
Nowhere here, nor should there be here, too much mention of the actual spaces that are being used throughout those. Does the new buyer understand who has control of that stack of meeting rooms adjacent to the elevator in the 4th and the senior building?
I don't know the answer to your question.
Do they understand that we have control of this space, which is in the senior room,
Yes.
and the senior center?
They understand, we don't have control of the senior center, but they understand their obligations with respect to maintaining a senior center since it's in the ground lease.
We're supposed to have some sort of control over how people live here. We have to do with how people live here. Do you have any indication what that $25 million is going to be spent on?
I have no specific itemization regarding that.
Is there anyone here who can answer my question?
There are representatives here.
Come on up.
The only thing that I do know is that it was going to go for capital improvements, including facade work and other improvements to it.
Yep, introduce yourself.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Hi, thank you. I'm Amanda Rizzoe. This is Evan Alexson. We were here, I believe it was last week, presenting this deal initially. So the $25 million has been reserved to do base building work as well as potential renovations, whether it's upgrading, the facade of the building, making sure that the pointing is done well, that there are no cracks in the facade, making sure that the roofs aren't leaking, making sure that the elevator elevators are upgraded. And then we're also potentially thinking about improving the common area experience for all the tenants, so that all the tenants can, let's say, we have, I didn't hear you back there, but you said that there's some common area rooms adjacent to some elevators. What we've seen is maybe there's a potential to make, let's say, a lounge for the tenants, or places that are currently not used, like some of the community rooms that are used for storage, but maybe some of the tenants would like to use that as a place for, you know, either relaxing or working during the day if they're at work from home, or during the weekends. So to be quite honest, because we don't own the property yet, we haven't had the opportunity to really do a full scope of what that $25 million would go towards. But I do have to say that it's something that we like to do when we purchase a property, is meet with the tenants and to understand what's important to them before going in and changing how people live at the property. So that's also definitely a big consideration of ours.
Well, I'm quite certain there's so many people working on it, the give and take of the agreement itself are pretty well aligned with the three topics that Alex outlined. But as I mentioned the other day, I live in a building.
Yep.
I'm concerned with the building's livability, and I just lost track of the word, but good things for tenants. Someone help me.
Amenities.
Thank you, everybody. And things like that. So that's the basis for my questions today. And I'm gonna ask one more, and then I'm gonna let you go. If in fact, after you've done your due diligence, you find that the capital improvements in the building are gonna require more than $25 million, are you prepared to pledge that?
So, to a certain extent, yes, it depends what the issue is. I can't say definite, because I don't, it's a hypothetical, but we are funding that $25 million with private capital. It is not coming from any sort of state agency or any sort of government agency, it's private capital. So we are able to get, if we're able to get approval, we could potentially increase that $25 million. There's definitely a path forward if it's possible.
I have no question.
This was discussed at our October 7th meeting, Monday, and you presented there, and there was some opportunity to answer questions. One of the open items was a review of the financial transaction from RIOC's perspective, which you told us that John's been able to complete, and firms up the figures that were introduced at that time. We had an explanation of the affordability elements that are being preserved and being expanded, and the interest in meeting with the tenancy, and also opening lines of communication with the tenancy, so that there's a good transition and the possibility of improvements in the capital aspects of the building, the envelope of the building, and then also in the use of the building, and it brought a sensitivity to the community itself. So we felt satisfied. We had a sense of the committee that we were in favor of this project, with the reservations that we need to understand it in a more intricate way. This is not like some of the other issues that we've had before us, where we were actually amending a ground lease. This is an extension under an existing ground lease, and so we have a more limited purview. But with that, I would make the motion that this be brought forward.
And I think from the HCR perspective, one of the big things for us is the preservation of the affordable housing, which we think is obviously incredibly important for Roosevelt Island, and so we also support the project, as Susan was saying. Anybody else? All right.
I might ask, as long as you're here, if you could just review the affordable housing elements for the community.
Sure, no problem.
Yep.
So as you all know, or as some of you may know, Roosevelt Landings has about 1,003 units. Currently, there are about, let's say, 40 to 45%, I believe, of the property has Section 8 vouchers. A certain percentage are original tenants that were there since the Mitchell-Lama program was in place, and then there's a certain portion of the property, remainder of the property is market rate tenants. So about 55% of the property currently pays, they're either tenants with Section 8 vouchers or pay a bit below market rent. What we're trying to do is increase affordability there at the end of the day, so that 2/3 of the property is preserved and about 1/3 of the property is market rate housing. If you want to talk about tenants that are in place today, because some questions we get are how are tenants today impacted? Section 8 tenants and the LAP tenants, the Landlord Assistance Program tenants, are not impacted. They won't know any difference, except for the fact that we will be, again, doing some capital upgrades at the property. Market rate tenants that have been paying higher rents, if you were there in place when we close and take over, your rent, so long as you are in occupancy of your unit, will go up by prescribed increases that you will know in your lease, and it will be tied to the rent guideline for increases. Currently, market rate tenants are unencumbered, and they can have rent increases that are not
Could you make
prescribed.
that point again, please?
Sure. If you're a market rate tenant, you will get prescribed rent increases if you are currently living at the property when we purchase it. So that means that right now, if you're a market rate tenant, you don't necessarily know how much your rent will go up the next year, whereas we'll be able to tell you that because it will be tied to a published index.
So the memo says that the plan preserves 67%
Correct.
of Roosevelt Landings at rents ranging from 80% to 150% of AMI, with the remainder at market value. Tenants with market rate apartments at the time of closing will receive renewal leases with rent increases tied to the rent guideline board increases.
Exactly.
Until they vacate, and then it'll change, and Section 8 remains in place.
Exactly.
So I think that's very good. I'll make a motion.
Second.
Okay, before we take a vote, Mr. Pratt has disclosed that he does live in the building, and while that is the case, it is our opinion that there is no conflict of interest if he so chooses to vote on this resolution. Mr. Valea?
I move.
I'll second.
Oh, okay. Mr. Valea?
It needs a
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh.
Ms. Reeser?
Aye.
Mr. Escobar?
Yes.
Mr. Capel?
Yes.
Mr. Pratt?
Yes.
Mr. Pollock?
Yes.
Mr. Echo?
Yes.
Mr. Shinzaki?
Yes.
Motion is passed.
All right.